Well, hello everyone. This is another episode of the Brandon and Brian show, or Brian and Brandon show, as Brian likes to call it. But we are here to continue our discussions of the different content that we find in our Be Thou My Vision book that we've been working through as a church. And this day we're going to talk about the Westminster Confession of Faith, or really the all the documents, maybe in a general sense of the Westminster Confession, Westminster Larger Catechism, Westminster Shorter Catechism. Might need to just discuss the differences between those and why they exist. But Brian, why don't you explain a little bit about why we care about this Westminster Confession of Faith, this document, and where it came from?
Sure. Yeah, this one is particularly interesting, I think, because in England, Parliament actually calls together all of these pastors, thinkers, Christians to come and discuss these things. And they eventually do come up with what we call a shorter and a larger catechism. Remember, the catechism is teachings for new believers, children. It's just the kind of essence of the faith that you find from the confession. So the confessions are the kind of meat on the bones, so to speak. But they go through and they do the catechism and the confession. So they actually call them the Westminster Divines, which is still a great band name. I don't care what anyone says. The Westminster Divines is a good one. But they all come together for several years and they produce these documents that, again, are being used to this day. So our particular denomination does adhere to these. And so in the Be Thou My Vision, they're using this catechism as well as the Heidelberg Catechism. And as you've heard us say, Westminster is typically thought of as being more precise theologically. They want to get things correct, where Heidelberg wants to get things correct, but it really wants to speak to, I guess, to use a phrase that we would use, like speak to where people are at,
Yeah.
right? It's much more tailored for the person rather than the doctrine, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And it's so different for us where other times and other places in history, you might have just all these bishops come together. The Westminster Divines were made up of, there was like 30 members of parliament were a part of the Westminster Divines. There were representatives from Scotland. There was like, different representatives from each country. And so it was very much a political, here's what the Church of England is going to believe. And then of course they didn't really adopt it for very long. As soon as the monarchy comes back in power, they no longer accepted this as kind of being the rule um of faith, for England. And then they blamed the Presbyterians because they said mostly the Presbyterians came up with it. Um, but what's important too is when you think of Puritanism and the founding of our country, the big groups that were coming over were those that held to kind of the Westminster Confession, Divine's theological commitments, along with the particular Baptists that held to the London 16, wherever it is. You can look it up. The London 16 something confession, which is pretty much just like the Westminster Confession, not the catechism and the shorter catechism, um, but just different views on baptism. Everything else, it's identical. So vast majority of what, when you hear the word Puritans in this country, what did they believe? Just read the Westminster, you know, documents. That's pretty much what they believed. For the,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. One other thing that I think of, Brandon, when we talk about this is how all of these things are about their time, right? So one thing that you'll notice as you look at some of these older documents, just as if you like, literature around this time, it's reflecting a different time than ours, And so they have different things that they're leaning into. So, like one of them that you see in the confession and the catechisms in the early Reformation, or the Reformation time here, is like images of Christ, and they're moving really, really strongly against what they felt like was specifically the Catholic influence of icons and things like that.
Yeah.
So sometimes things that we see in there are are maybe a little more startling, or we're not used to seeing them, but there's a context to it. And the more that you know about those things, the more that you'll understand that they're addressing what is happening at that day. The Westminster Divines, as far as I know, weren't thinking this was going to be read, in the 21st century. They were, trying to address what they felt like was universal, but not necessarily for the church of all time, which is what the Bible is for.
Yeah. And so in the work of the divine, so they had a confession, which is just positive statements of the faith, right? So it's not that question and answer kind of format.
Mm-hmm.
And then they had the larger and the shorter catechism, which is in this, question and answer format for the purpose of education, right? And so here's the problems of the time, here's the things that we're dealing with. And originally, the larger catechism was what the pastors were held to. The
Mm-hmm.
pastors had to have memorized basically the larger catechisms and the answers to prove that they were equipped to be, ministers of the gospel. And the kids would be catechized and with the shorter catechism. And now we're lucky. We just tell like pastors that are coming through, yeah, if you kind of know the first 50 shorter catechism questions, you'll be good. But the standards were pretty high to really understand the broad content. But it gets more simplistic as you go to the shorter catechism, which we think of it as being real rich in comparison, but not as detailed. Um,
Right.
but you talk about their precision. What's interesting, a lot of people say that there were differences. Like when you start to look at the discussions that they would have on particular points. And so sometimes the language is precise in a sense, but it's precise in a way that allows for at least some nuance of perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes there were different versions, different perspectives on
Right.
what a particular point would have meant. And it's
That's
important.
actually,
Yeah,
sorry.
go
I was
ahead.
just going to say that's actually a really good point, because, these things don't take years because everyone agrees on every possible point, right?
Yeah, it takes
They
years because here's how we can say this and say, yep,
right,
I can agree with that. I'm going to practically apply that maybe a little bit differently than you,
right,
but you're right. We both can say, yep, I can say that and be honest in saying that I believe it.
right.
And it's important for, I think, our church to understand what this Westminster Confession is, because this is what we are held to, right, Brian? And neither one of us are currently active on the session, but once an elder in the PCA, you're always an elder until you get in trouble for heresy or whatnot. uh, we're always on the edge, always on the line. But elders and pastors are held to the standards of the Westminster Confession of Faith, and if we are teaching, preaching, living out something that's contrary to what the confession says, we should be called on it, right? We
Mm-hmm.
have made a commitment that, and when we said, as you keep bringing up, we have said that these are accurate statements of what the Bible is teaching.
Mm-hmm.
Like they are not infallible statements, but properly understood, they are accurate statements of what the Bible teaches. Um,
Right.
and that's a point we keep trying to hammer home, because we don't want to try to say, hey, we believe in these documents on par with Scripture. We don't. We believe, and that's what the catechisms and the larger catechism particularly make, that there's one rule of faith and practice, you know,
Right.
and that is the
Right.
Scripture. So the confession itself points to Scripture as being our one rule.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, no, I think it's a good point that, our church denomination, anybody that's watching this, that is part of our church, that's a member of the church, this is sort of that umbrella that is over us, that guides our faith and practice as it reflects what we believe about Scripture. So yeah, it's a very important, rich document. You can read all kinds of interesting things about it, but I love that they do include this catechism in the Be Thou My Vision book.
Yeah. All right, Brian, I think that's probably enough for this one. So please, if you have any questions, grab Brian before and after worship and ask him any very particular theological questions. You know who you are when I say that in our church congregation. I'm sure you're watching. Anyway, so just thank you for another episode, and we will be back shortly.